There was a time when food wasn't just something you ate, it was a performance, a memory, a little slice of home served with pride. The table was a stage where every dish told its own story, from the glimmer of gelatin molds catching candlelight to the golden crust of a casserole pulled fresh from the oven. Recipes weren't just instructions, they were traditions, handed down like whispered family secrets, each one carrying the fingerprints of generations before us. But somewhere between convenience foods and takeout menus, these treasures slipped quietly into the shadows. What happened to the dishes that once made neighbors lean over the fence just to ask, "What's cooking?" The ones that made Sunday suppers feel like holidays, and holiday tables feel like art galleries of flavor and color? Today, we're opening those old, dog-eared cookbooks and pulling back the curtain on recipes that once defined comfort, celebration, and cleverness in the kitchen. From savory showpieces to sweet curiosities, these forgotten creations remind us that food isn't just about feeding the body, it's about feeding the soul. So dust off the serving platter, polish the good silver, and get ready to step back into a world where every bite carried a story, and every story began with a recipe worth remembering. Cottage cheese with canned fruit cocktail might sound like a strange pairing to the modern palate, but in its heyday, it was the perfect marriage of practicality, nutrition, and a touch of dinner table flair. This was a dish that could appear at a humble weekday lunch or be dressed up for a Sunday spread, proof that elegance didn't have to be expensive. Picture a perfectly round scoop of creamy, tangy cottage cheese, its surface dotted with tiny curds like fresh snow, sitting proudly in the center of a plate. Around it, jewel-toned fruit cocktail spilled its syrupy sweetness, golden peach slices, rhubarb cherries, pale grapes, and cubes of pear so tender they almost melted at the touch of a fork. The fruit syrup pooled slightly beneath the cheese, creating a ready-made dressing that seeped into each bite. Served in glass dessert cups or atop crisp lettuce leaves, it was a study in contrasts. The cool, milky richness of the cheese played against the bright, sugary fruit, creating a balance that somehow felt both refreshing and indulgent. In an age before Greek yogurt parfaits and smoothie bowls, this was the colorful, protein-packed answer to quick yet wholesome eating. It wasn't just about flavor, it was about presentation. Housewives and home economists alike understood the visual appeal, creamy white against bright yellows, reds, and greens. The dish practically glowed under the warm light of a kitchen table, a reminder that even canned goods could be transformed into something cheerful and welcoming. Community cookbooks of the mid-century were full of variations, some adding a sprinkle of cinnamon, others a dollop of whipped cream for dessert like decadence. No matter the version, cottage cheese with canned fruit cocktail was the kind of recipe that proved resourcefulness could be beautiful, and beauty could be served in a simple bowl. Buttered cornflake toast was one of those quietly brilliant mid-century creations that turned the simplest pantry staples into something special. It wasn't flashy, but it had a kind of magic, born from thrift, shaped by creativity, and remembered for the way it made an ordinary morning feel just a little indulgent. At its heart, it was as simple as it sounds: slices of fresh white bread generously spread with softened butter, topped with a thick layer of crushed cornflakes, then sprinkled with a touch of sugar for good measure. The bread went into the oven until the edges curled golden brown, the butter melted into every nook, and the cornflakes transformed into a brittle, toasty crown that shattered with each bite. The genius of buttered cornflake toast was its texture. The bottom was soft, warm, and comforting, the kind of bread that yielded to the slightest pressure of your teeth, while the top offered a satisfying crunch, sweetened just enough to make it feel like a treat. Each bite was a little dance between tender and crisp, buttery and sugary, familiar and surprising. This was a breakfast that didn't require a special trip to the store. In households where cereal was a constant and bread a staple, it could be thrown together in minutes. It filled kitchens with the warm, toasty scent of butter and grain, a smell that had a way of drawing sleepy children to the table before the plates even hit the surface. Some cooks dressed it up with a drizzle of honey, others served it alongside coffee for adults and warm milk for the kids. But no matter the variation, buttered cornflake toast was proof that comfort could be baked into the simplest things, a reminder that a few humble ingredients, in the right hands, could make any morning brighter. Cornflake-crusted fried bologna was one of those recipes that proved you didn't need expensive cuts of meat to create something memorable. In kitchens where thrift and creativity walked hand in hand, this dish took the humble lunch meat slice and transformed it into a crispy, golden indulgence worthy of a special occasion. It started with thick-cut slices of bologna, chosen not for luxury, but for the way they could hold their own in a hot skillet. Each slice was dipped into beaten egg, then pressed into a bed of crushed cornflakes until every surface was coated in that familiar, craggy cereal crunch. From there, the slices hit sizzling butter or oil, the cornflake crust turning golden almost instantly, sending up that warm, toasty scent only frying can create. The magic was in the contrast. Beneath the crisp shell, the bologna turned tender and juicy, its salty richness playing perfectly against the sweet, buttery cornflake coating. With each bite, the crunch gave way to a savory center, making it impossible to stop at just one slice. Served hot from the pan, it could be eaten on its own as a snack, topped with mustard for a quick lunch, or tucked between slices of soft bread for a sandwich that felt far fancier than it was. Kids loved it for the crunch, adults appreciated it for the resourcefulness. In an era when nothing went to waste, cornflake-crusted fried bologna was more than a recipe, it was a lesson in making the ordinary extraordinary. It took pantry staples and turned them into something that made people linger at the table just a little longer, savoring the moment. Because sometimes, the best meals aren't the ones that cost the most, they're the ones that surprise you with just how good simple can be. Smoked turkey necks were the kind of ingredient that didn't just flavor a dish, they told a story. In southern kitchens, they were more than a cut of meat, they were the soul behind countless pots of greens, beans, and stews. Long before supermarkets lined their shelves with pre-packaged broth, cooks used smoked turkey necks to create deep, rich flavor from scratch, turning even the simplest ingredients into something unforgettable. The process started at the smokehouse or over an outdoor pit, where turkey necks were slow-smoked over hickory or oak until the skin turned a deep mahogany and the meat absorbed that unmistakable, woodsy aroma. The scent alone could pull you halfway across the yard. Once smoked, they were ready to work their magic, not as a centerpiece on the plate, but as the heartbeat of the pot. Dropped into simmering collard greens or butter beans, the necks released layers of savory richness, the meat softening until it could be coaxed from the bone with the gentlest nudge of a fork. The broth would take on a smoky depth, every spoonful carrying whispers of the fire that kissed the meat hours earlier. Families cherished smoked turkey necks for their thriftiness as much as their taste. They stretched meals, added protein, and made vegetables taste like a feast. In church cookbooks and handwritten recipe cards, they were a quiet constant, never the headline dish, but always the reason everything else tasted so good. Served in humble kitchens or at big family gatherings, smoked turkey necks embodied the idea that good cooking wasn't about luxury ingredients, it was about patience, care, and knowing how to coax magic out of what you had. In their smoky, savory way, they reminded us that flavor comes from history, and history often comes from the humblest cuts. Buttered cornflake toast. In the lean years of the 1930s and 40s, breakfast wasn't always bacon sizzling in a skillet or stacks of fluffy pancakes. For many American families, it was about stretching every crumb and making do with what was already in the pantry. That's where buttered cornflake toast made its humble appearance, a dish so simple it bordered on ingenious. Imagine a slice of day-old bread, spread generously with butter, then coated with a layer of crushed cornflakes. Into the oven it went, toasting until the edges of the bread turned golden and the cornflakes formed a delicate, crisp armor. The result? A satisfying crunch followed by the comforting chew of warm bread, something that felt indulgent even when times were tough. Mothers loved it because it turned stale bread into something new, and kids adored it because it had that sweet, toasty flavor that cereal alone couldn't deliver. Sometimes, a sprinkle of sugar or cinnamon would be added for extra comfort on cold mornings. In rural towns, this toast was a regular feature at church breakfasts or school fundraisers, easy to make in large batches, and cheap enough to feed a crowd. What's fascinating is that buttered cornflake toast lived in that sweet spot between necessity and creativity. It's proof that American cooks, even in hard times, could find ways to make a meal feel special. Today, it's almost entirely forgotten, buried under decades of trendier breakfasts, but one bite can still transport you back to a kitchen where the smell of butter filled the air and frugality was met with pride, not shame. And maybe that's the lesson: even the simplest ingredients, handled with a little love, can make a memory that lasts far longer than the toast itself. Applesauce Jell-O salad, the sweet and tangy table filler. There was a time, not too long ago, when no holiday table in small-town America felt complete without at least one jewel-toned Jell-O creation. Among them, the applesauce Jell-O salad stood out as a curious favorite, a dish that straddled the line between dessert and side, sweet and savory, tradition and trend. This salad's origins can be traced back to the mid-20th century, when convenience foods ruled American kitchens. Post-war homemakers, eager to impress yet pressed for time, embraced recipes that were quick, affordable, and just flashy enough to catch the eye. A box of cherry or strawberry gelatin, a jar of applesauce, and sometimes a dash of cinnamon, that's all it took to create something that shimmered under the dining room light. The magic was in the transformation. The applesauce added a gentle, fruity tartness that cut through the sugary Jell-O, creating a surprisingly refreshing bite. For many families, it became a Sunday dinner staple, often served alongside ham, turkey, or roast beef, a splash of color against a sea of beige and brown. Children loved it for its wobbly, playful texture. Adults appreciated how it paired with savory meats without feeling too heavy. In church cookbooks and junior league recipe collections, applesauce Jell-O salad was often presented as foolproof, impossible to ruin, endlessly adaptable. Some cooks folded in crushed pineapple or chopped nuts, others topped it with a dollop of whipped cream for extra indulgence. Today, it's rarely seen outside vintage recipe blogs or the occasional retro-themed potluck, yet for those who remember, one spoonful can bring back decades of memories, the laughter of family gatherings, the clink of serving spoons, and the comforting belief that something so simple could still feel special. Tomato and sugar open-faced sandwiches. It sounds strange to modern ears, but in the mid-20th century, this was considered a perfectly normal, even delightful, treat in many American homes. Born out of a time when fresh produce was seasonal and sugar was an everyday kitchen staple, this dish offered a quick bite that was equal parts sweet and savory. The base was simple, a slice of soft white bread, spread generously with creamy butter or margarine. Then came the fresh, garden-picked tomato, usually a thick, juicy slice cut right from the vine. Instead of salt or pepper, the topping was a generous sprinkle of granulated sugar, allowing the juice of the tomato to mingle with the sweet crystals, creating a syrupy glaze that soaked into the bread. This odd pairing made perfect sense in the rural kitchens of the 1940s through the 1960s. Tomatoes were often a staple in backyard gardens, and families wasted nothing. The sugar wasn't just a flavor enhancer, it was a way to mask the tang of less-than-ripe tomatoes, making them more palatable. And for kids, the sweetness made vegetables far more appealing. In small towns and farmhouses, these open-faced sandwiches would often appear as a mid-afternoon snack, a quick breakfast, or even as part of a light summer supper when the heat made heavier meals unappealing. They were especially popular during the height of tomato season, when baskets of the red fruit sat ripening on kitchen counters. Today, the idea might raise eyebrows: tomatoes with sugar instead of salt? But for those who grew up with them, one bite can bring back memories of hot kitchens, sun-warmed gardens, and the comfort of a simple treat made with love. It's a reminder of an era when food was less about trends and more about using what you had in the most satisfying way possible. Celery Victor, the salad that surprised San Francisco. If you strolled into San Francisco's St. Francis Hotel in the early 1900s, you might have been greeted not with oysters or roast duck, but a chilled plate of celery. Yes, celery, but not just any celery. This was Celery Victor, a dish so refined and unexpected that it became the talk of the city's upper crust for decades. The story begins with Victor Hertzler, the legendary chef of the St. Francis, who believed vegetables deserved the same glamour as any fine entree. At a time when celery was mostly a crunchy garnish, he transformed it into the star of the plate. His method was simple yet precise. Whole celery hearts were simmered gently in a seasoned broth, often flavored with beef stock or veal bones, until just tender. Then, instead of serving them warm, they were chilled overnight, allowing the flavors to deepen. When served, the celery stalks glistened like emerald ones, arranged neatly and dressed with a light vinaigrette or sometimes a creamy sauce. Guests marveled at the elegance of taking something humble from the garden and presenting it with the pomp of fine dining. It was proof that a chef's imagination could elevate even the simplest ingredient into a culinary statement. By the 1920s, Celery Victor had spread beyond San Francisco, appearing in hotel menus and cookbooks across America. Housewives embraced it for luncheons, bridge clubs, and summer gatherings, where it stood out among heavier fare. But as tastes shifted and salads became more complex, piled with meats, cheeses, and bold dressings, Celery Victor quietly slipped into obscurity. Today, its charm lies in its restraint, a crisp, chilled bite that whispers of an era when presentation was as important as flavor. A dish born from creativity, now nearly forgotten. Tomato aspic, the gelatin jewel of yesterday's table. There was a time when the most elegant thing you could place on a dinner table wasn't a roast or a pie, it was a shimmering, quivering ring of tomato aspic. In the mid-20th century, especially from the 1930s through the 1960s, this savory gelatin dish was the mark of a hostess who knew her way around both style and flavor. At its heart, tomato aspic was simple: spiced tomato juice or puree, flavored with onions, celery, and cloves, thickened with unflavored gelatin. Once molded, it would hold its shape in perfect, jewel-like form. Some versions hid little surprises: diced vegetables, shrimp, or even hard-boiled eggs, suspended inside the translucent red. Its popularity was partly due to the era's obsession with mold foods. Gelatin wasn't just dessert, it was a canvas. Cookbooks praised tomato aspic as a refreshing side for summer luncheons or a sophisticated salad course before the main entree. Served cold and sliced into perfect wedges, it was often paired with mayonnaise, cottage cheese, or crisp lettuce leaves for contrast. The appeal also came from its practicality. In a time before home refrigeration was as reliable as today's, gelatin helped preserve freshness. Plus, it could be made ahead, ideal for busy hostesses juggling bridge parties, Sunday suppers, and church socials. But somewhere along the way, the savory gelatin trend faded. By the 1980s, tomato aspic had become more of a curiosity than a centerpiece, often remembered with a mix of nostalgia and disbelief. Still, for those who grew up in the glow of its rhubarb shimmer, tomato aspic isn't strange. It's a reminder of a time when presentation was everything, and even a humble tomato could be transformed into a work of edible art. Mock oyster casserole. In the days before refrigeration made seafood widely accessible, cooks often had to get creative to recreate coastal flavors in landlocked towns. This dish, found in mid-century community cookbooks and wartime recipe collections, is one of the cleverest examples. Despite its name, there's not a single oyster in sight. Instead, home cooks would use eggplant, boiled, peeled, and chopped, for its soft, briny texture that mimics shellfish surprisingly well. The oysters were then mixed with crushed saltine crackers, onion sautéed in butter, and a generous pour of milk or cream. A dash of Worcestershire sauce and a sprinkle of black pepper gave it that savory, ocean-like note, while some cooks swore by adding just a hint of celery salt for depth. The mixture was layered in a baking dish, topped with more buttery crackers, and baked until golden and bubbling. This recipe was especially popular during the Great Depression and World War II, when both oysters and other fresh seafood were either prohibitively expensive or rationed. It let families enjoy the idea of an oyster casserole without the cost, and it introduced many inland diners to a seafood dish for the first time, even if it came from a garden patch instead of a fishing boat. Its charm lies not just in the flavor, but in its ingenuity. Rural homemakers didn't see limitations as obstacles, they saw them as puzzles to solve. With nothing but a few vegetables, pantry staples, and an adventurous spirit, they could mimic a delicacy that once seemed reserved for the wealthy. Today, a mock oyster casserole offers a nostalgic taste of that make-do era, creamy, comforting, and a little playful, reminding us that the best recipes don't always come from abundance, but from creativity. Smoked squirrel, a backwoods delicacy. Long before supermarkets stocked endless rows of packaged meat, rural America relied on what the land and forest could provide. And for many families, especially in the Appalachian Mountains and rural South, squirrel wasn't just game, it was dinner. But smoked squirrel? That was a rare, prized preparation reserved for when you wanted to turn humble foraging into something extraordinary. The tradition of smoking squirrel goes back to early settlers and frontier folk, who needed methods to preserve meat without refrigeration. Squirrel meat, lean and mild, takes beautifully to smoke. Hunters would clean and quarter the animal, then rub it down with salt, pepper, and sometimes wild herbs like sage or thyme. Hickory, oak, or applewood were the woods of choice, each lending a different note to the final flavor. In a slow smoking pit, the squirrel would rest for hours, bathed in fragrant, curling smoke until the flesh turned tender enough to pull apart. The skin crisped slightly, locking in a smoky-sweet aroma that drifted through the air, often drawing neighbors over just to check in. Smoked squirrel was often served alongside skillet cornbread, wild greens, or stewed beans. It wasn't just about the taste, it was about the ritual, the early morning hunt, the careful preparation, and the shared meal that followed. In many households, it was a point of pride to serve perfectly smoked squirrel, as it showed skill in both hunting and cooking. While it might seem unusual today, for those who grew up with it, smoked squirrel wasn't strange, it was comfort food. A bite brought the taste of crisp autumn mornings, wood smoke curling from a chimney, and the satisfaction of living directly off the land. It's a recipe almost lost now, but in its time, smoked squirrel was a delicious symbol of resourcefulness, community, and the flavors of a wilder America.